Welcome friends, paint friends. This is How to Theater Painting Faux Wood. Upfront disclaimer for all my painting demos is that there are lots and lots of ways to do all of these things. And various painters have different ways of doing this. So these are my ways. They are not necessarily the way. Talking about hard surfaces and not drops is what I'm going to be doing mostly today. So painting on drops versus painting on hard surfaces is sort of a different animal. Most of the techniques are the same, but the opacity of your paint is going to be very different. So similar principles, but it's not exactly the same, not a direct one-to-one translation. A lot of my experiences with floors and with hard surfaces, so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So why do we do this? We are doing scenic textures. We paint textures because every surface kind of requires it in theater. A lot of stage lighting washes out a lot of our surfaces, and so we have to add that detail to make it look more realistic and not so flat. So we're simulating that depth, and in this case, we're painting wood to look like wood, which is a huge part of what scenic painters do, is painting wood surfaces to look more like wood. For instance, all the stuff back here, you can kind of see this is wood, but it kind of flattens out in the light, and you can kind of tell it's wood. But under stage light, it would wash out. We have to add all that depth, and we have to make that. And besides, we want to be able to control the color of the woods too. A lot of times, your designers, are, like myself, are going to want to have control over the color as well. So. Now, the quality of what you're doing for your painted woods is going to vary depending on like how close your audience is as well, like how exaggerated do you need to be. But a lot of our spaces here are very close to the audience, so I tend to be fairly detailed in what we're doing, but you can exaggerate things further if they're further away. So slightly more cartoony will read differently in different kinds of spaces. So. All right, so before I get too far into the wood textures, in case you weren't here for my last one, I need to cover what Scenic Paint is. So this is Scenic Paint. It's by Roscoe. Well, this brand is by Roscoe. It's off Broadway, and it is made of. It's made specifically for theater. And the reason that we have our own special paint is because it's slightly different than something, say, house paint. So, how is it different, you may ask? Well, all paint, whether it's this or house paint, is made up of three sort of basic components. There's a lot of ingredients, but they essentially add up to the three basic components, which is pigment, which is your color, right? Binder, which sticks it to stuff. And vehicle, which keeps it smooth and liquid so that you can apply it. So the reason scenic paint is different than regular house paint is because the ratios of those three things is different. For instance, if you've seen any house paint get mixed at the hardware store, you may have noticed that when they open up the can to insert the pigment, like, it might be already full all the way up to this silver line on this can already, and then they insert the color. So that tells you that the pigment is this much, right? And everything else is binder and vehicle. So scenic paint, that ratio is much different. We have much less binder and vehicle and a lot more pigment. And the reason we do that is because we want to be able to thin this way down in order to get lots of layers of things, because layers give us depth. So, and the depth is what we're after. So we also have supersats. These are even extra super concentrated versions. And you can thin these down like 8:1 and still get really good color out of them, which is amazing. It kind of acts a little bit like a dye. You can also use actual dye, but that's a little bit more hazardous, so we don't. That's really great for drops, but that's not what we're really talking about today. So that's why Scenic Paint, and that's why not house paint. I do still use house paint for base colors a lot. So like I use house paint or like white and black basic colors. They do make Scenic white and black, but that adds up. Scenic Paint is a little bit more expensive than regular house paint, although nowadays that's not necessarily true. House paint seems to be getting more expensive, but Scenic Paint will last you, because you're thinning it out a lot of the times, it will last you longer, and it's worth the investment to go ahead and just get some. And so, for instance, the base color for the project we're going to be doing here today was made with white paint and then some Scenic Paint mixed in for a little bit of color to make it a little bit more of a cream. So what else do I need to cover here? There's not a lot of too many safety concerns. Obviously, if you were using dye, you would want to be wearing a mask and gloves, etc. If you're getting a lot of paint on you all the time, gloves are a decent idea, but mostly we're pretty good. So, in order to paint wood, we need to understand a little bit about wood, and the differences in the grain, because grain is where it's at. So, I've got some different samples here. I'm going to use the back of this dude. So I'm going to bring it over to this camera. As you can see, this has got a lot of grain in it and has a lot of knots in it. This is, when they are cutting wood, things like 2x4 and larger pieces of wood like that are cut straight out of tree trunks. And so the grain tends to be a lot more straight because it's going straight up and down your trunk. Things that are thinner, like veneer and like Luan, because Luan is made out of lots of thin layers, often that's made from peeling around the tree. So you're getting a lot more of the pattern from the tree that way, and that's why you get a lot more knots. And knots are formed where branches grow out of the tree. So, and your different kinds of trees are naturally going to give you different kinds of patterns to your wood. Also, if your wood is cut across the grain, it's going to have a very different pattern. So understanding what it is you're trying to emulate is important. So for instance, veneer, if you're painting a piece of furniture, most furniture is covered with veneer and it has a lot of really great texture like this. That's, so you might see a lot of grain on the veneer, but on floors, it's going to be a lot more of this kind of stuff where the grain is a lot more straight up and down, a lot less knots. And because homes really don't want a lot of knots in your wood floors, they think of them as sort of irregular, you tend to not see as many in floors. And so that saves you some hassle and having to paint them. So you got to kind of know a little bit about that. Also, because it's a natural material, it doesn't have a lot of pattern to it. So a lot of what we're doing as painters is trying to not create patterns, which is hard because our brain wants to make patterns. It's what we like to do. So if you're painting, say, an entire floor of wood, it's very easy to get caught up in doing a pattern when you're not paying attention. So keeping that pattern and the randomization of what you're doing in mind is really important. All right, so first thing you got to do is you got to base paint your surface. So here we have a pre-painted flat. It's a little hard to tell the color because of cameras and things wash everything out. But this is a cream. It sort of almost looks like the color of Luan. But and there's a couple ways you can base things. You can do it with a brush if you have the time for that, because that takes forever. It does really great things to the pattern, right? Like having the grain of your brush from brushing it on is really nice. So if you do decide to brush on the surface, like a piece of furniture, for instance, you want to make sure that you're going with the grain of that wood. And if you've got a piece of furniture that has a lot of different directions of wood, you need to make sure that you're basing it in those directions as well, because that grain is going to show up in what you're doing. So most of the time we're rollering it on. So we're just using a roller. I'm not actually going to base anything, but this is a pretty typical roller. Foam rollers also work really well. This one, it happens to be more, a regular kind. The foam rollers tend to give you a lot finer texture to the surface, like it's not as coarse. As if you think about the walls painted in your house, like they have sort of a dappled texture to it, and that's what your roller is going to give you. Foam rollers give you a much less dappled texture, and for wood that can be really handy. So you could also do you could combine the base coat and this first step that the second step we're gonna talk about into one by wet blending your base color by using two different colors blended together. We'll talk a little bit more about wet blending in a minute, but you could also skip straight to that step in your base coat, but that is definitely brushing it on. And you may or may not want to do that because you may have, like if it's a whole floor, that's probably not very practical. So your color for your wood tends to want to be pretty light. If it's a very, very dark wood, you could start with the black or a dark base, a dark brown. That's a little different. So, but it's mostly better to work from light to dark. So that's what we're going to be doing today. All right, so when you're creating a wood surface, the first thing after you base coating things is you got to lay out what your pattern of boards are. So for instance, if you're doing a floor, which is a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today, or any surface, you have to measure out all your board lines, how far apart your boards are. And in this case, that's extremely important because the boards themselves and their width and the layout says a lot about, like they all carry meanings. For instance, I have a sample here I'm going to throw on the floor. Might be a little hard to get it all, but so, you know, you can do all kinds of different wood. And so some of that is much rougher and some of that is much finer, and how you're going to approach each one is going to be a little bit different, especially when it comes to color, obviously. But the board widths, so you can see here in the rough wood, the board widths are sort of more random. They're not all uniform. That tells you something about that structure. In the finer wood, it's all pretty regular. But for instance, so most floors in your home are going to be like potentially, or mostly 4-inch wide boards. So a house with a fine, nice floor is going to be 4-inch boards. You don't want to get too much smaller or too much bigger than that. 3 inches looks a little too tiny, and 4 is just right. 5 starts to get verging on 6, and 6 is kind of what you do for a less refined wood. 6 inches is a nice wide, like this guy here, I think it's probably about 6 inches. It might be closer to 8. But for rougher, like barns and barnwood and maybe more rustic homes, 6 inches is good. If you get up to things like 8 inches, and if you're looking for really rustic like a barn, 8 inches is good size, and random sizes is really good for extremely rustic stuff, right? You got to think about how it's being made and how it's being built. All right, I'm going to put this away. I'm not going to take the time to roll it up. All right. So yeah, that information, like the width of your boards, tells you a little bit about the owner of that space, whatever the space may be that you're making. The other thing about it is that you need to make sure that your layout is really good, especially if the layout is more complicated. I'm going to show you some patterns over here. So for instance, this is a complicated layout for ragtime that we did. And so we had to make sure all of those things line up. If they get like off, then you're going to notice pretty quickly if they start getting wonky. So it's important to make sure that everything you're working on is square, and that you know what the square is. So if you're measuring boards, for instance, I'm going to go to the floor. Oh, I made a mess on my project already. So if you're measuring boards out, you want to make sure that you're measuring from the same direction on them. So you might put marks at one end and you might put marks on the other end, and you got to make sure you're measuring from the same distance. A lot of really helpful things in a space can help you with layout. For instance, the center line and the plaster line of your theater. If you're laying out wood, platforms, the breaks in the platforms or the sheet goods will help you, but you have to make sure that those have been laid out nice and square. And then you can measure from them. So another trick is to make sure that if you're painting wood this direction, you want to make sure that your sheet goods, like for instance the masonite or whatever you're using to paint the floor on, you want to make sure that it's laid out in the direction of the wood too, if you have that availability. Like, not everybody gets to have a say about the way in which the floor is laid out. But if you do, try and make sure that your board lines are going the same direction as your sheet goods. Unless it's something narrow, like a 4-foot wide platform that looks like a dock or something, then you can go across it and it doesn't really matter as much. But if you have large swaths of areas, you want your wood grain to cross as few seams as possible is the point. Because those seams tend to give away the ghost a little bit in terms of the fantasy that you are creating. So, after you've got everything laid out, and I have already done the layout marks on my little sample here, you'll want to do some lining. So right here we have what's called a lining stick. It is a large chunk of wood that's beveled on the bottom. We actually also have a separate piece that stands it up from the floor, and it has a handle for it and it's lightweight. Lining sticks are great for lining. They're basically rulers, right? They're giant straight edges. Because the thing that's going to sell your wood is how straight the boards are. So that's important. And so I'm lining up my lines. And the reason that the edges on it are beveled is because if any paint gets on it, you don't want any of it to like run underneath your work, right? So for instance, if the wood was sitting directly onto the surface and paint got on it, it would get down and under and underneath your stick and would make a mess. So, grab the bamboo. So this is the trickiest part of doing the wood, because your layout has to be good and your lines have to be nice and neat. So this is the hardest part. So the paint for this, I usually use something dark. This happens to be a Van Dyke brown. It looks pretty much black, but it is technically a brown, which will help later with blending in. And I'm charging the brush up right now, which means I'm trying to get as much paint into it as possible so that it will travel a long distance. My particular project is not that far of a travel, but like I said, if you're doing a whole floor, sometimes you're going really long lines. And you're looking for as thin a knife point on your brush as you can. And these small 1-inch sashes are perfect for this. They get really knife-like and give you really beautiful, nice straight lines. And so now what I'm doing is I'm just putting it up here against here, and I'm holding it sort of awkwardly. I don't know if you can see that in my hand or not. Right? I'm holding this very awkwardly. It's like I'm trying to keep on the tip of the brush. Because that tip, that knife edge is where you want your line to be, if not on the side of the brush, right? Like if it's too shallow, then you're going to be painting with the side of the brush, and that's not very, and it'll get much thicker. So if you're doing this, which takes a lot of practice, I will say. I've been doing this for 20 years, so this takes a lot of practice. But if you're having trouble getting your lines to be thin, it might mean that you just need to tip your brush up. So I just set it on there, and with hardly any pressure at all, I'm just dragging it across the surface to get that nice little beautiful line. And then you do it ad infinitum if you have a whole floor. And it becomes your day, and that's what you do for the day. It's very zen. And you tend to move your whole body, not the brush, right? The idea here is that the brush is staying, like you don't want the brush to go like this, because that's going to change the width of your line every time, right? It's going to start thin, it's going to get thick, and then get thin again. So you want to keep the brush always going in at that same angle. So often you're not really moving the brush so much as you're moving your body. It's kind of like Tai Chi. You're kind of keeping that ball, right, in Tai Chi. You're keeping that ball in place and moving your body around. These brushes are so great. Oh, I see I had it on a little bit of an angle and made it a little thicker, but that's fine. Variety is good, right? I have not been doing a good job of getting them very well lined up. I'm going to try and do this really quickly so that we can move on. Mostly I'm not even touching the lining stick. You can also, if it's giving you trouble in terms of the position, you can tip it back a little as you do, but then you've got to really make sure that the angle of your brush stays the same, because if you don't, it messes it up big time. So there we got our board lines. You need to have the lining stick. You need your straight edge, essentially. And these little brushes are the bomb. 1-inch sashes, these happen to be from Worcester, are great. Protect them, keep them away from your students. They will not wash them out, and then they'll be a mess. Oops, no, that's not. This is my cleaning bucket. All right, so as you may have noticed, I didn't cover it a minute ago. I'm using a stick to extend, right? It's really difficult to do this on the floor by bending over with holding the brush, right? It's just not the same. It's really awkward to use sticks sometimes, but this bamboo is really great. Basically, it's just dried bamboo cut off, and then it has slits cut in it so that it can accept the brush, and then you rubber band it. It's super easy, and people have been doing it literally for centuries. So it works great, but it does take a little getting used to. You want to hold it not like calligraphy, right? You want to hold it where it's got some power, and you've got it, so it becomes like a second elbow. So let's move on to the next thing, I think. So before I do, you can use other things besides paint to do your layout. If your floor is never going to be used again, or your surface, whatever it is never going to be used again or repainted, you can use things like ink and markers. The ink and the markers will bleed through any paint you add, and it will be useful as you go through the process. Like using paint, like I'm going to have to reline this again at the end, because my lines will start disappearing as I add more paint. So the markers are really handy for that. But it also means you can never use it for anything else. Because the marker will keep bleeding up through whatever, like if you base coat it, it will come up through your base coat. So just as a general paint side note, don't use Sharpie or permanent marker on any scenery unless you intend it to be there forever. So, so you do have more options. And a lot of times, like for drops and things, they will use ink instead of paint, because that drop is only going to be for one purpose forever. Whereas for floors, we reuse a lot of our floors over and over again. Or if you're painting directly onto your stage floor, you do not want to use marker ink. Yes, let's move on to the next step. And for that, I need to swap out my project boards here, because I've got one that's already dry. So convenient. Did this yesterday. All right. So the next thing we're going to do are some wet blends, which is 2 or more colors being blended together on the surface to give you some variety and to get the color rolling. And also to start the graining process. So you're going to be painting these in the direction of the grain that you want the grain to go. And it will help start getting us some surface characteristics. So for this, I have pulled out, where are you? There you are. I'm going to go over here. This dude, which is the floor rendering I painted for Cabaret. I'm going to just tilt that up a little bit so you can see it. So this is what I was using to paint, what we were using to paint the floor for Cabaret. So this is what I'm using as the guide for the colors for the floor. Designers will usually give you something to work with, and if it's not an actual full floor rendering, hopefully it will be like a sample, like this one has both, right? So this is what I want the wood to look like, and this is the colors I want for that wood. So it's convenient and uses both things. But we're going to be using, this is sort of what the colors I've used the colors for today based off of this floor rendering for us today. So it's going to look a little bit like candy. It's like, why is it so bright colored? I have mixed some, this one is raw sienna and orange mixed together. This one is burnt sienna and raw sienna. They're all sort of similar. And this one, I believe, is just burnt umber, but it might have a little bit of Van Dyke in it. I don't know, maybe it's just burnt umber. I did not mix this one, I found it. Reuse. So, I have 3 different brushes with 3 different colors. All right, I need to set this up a little bit real quick, get these in here. If you use the same brush for all of the colors, it tends to get muddy. And so I've also got water over here. So I'm going to be dipping into the paint, which is, I would say, maybe the consistency of maybe cream or heavy cream. There were these great scenic painting videos from the 80s and 90s that used milk references to talk about thickness, the consistency of paints, and I've always loved that. I don't think it's heavy cream. It seems a little thinner than that. It's probably somewhere between cream and heavy cream. But and just a touch of water. And I actually usually go back a little bit, because I'm crazy that way. So in this case, I'm not really paying too much attention to the boards. I'm just putting color down. So without the water, you can see it'll be a little bit rougher. So you could use less water if you wanted, say, your wood to be less refined and more rough. Right? It doesn't have to even it doesn't have to cover everything. We're going to be using more colors. So Now I'm going to switch over to the reddish brown. This one is a little bit thicker, I think. So I will definitely use some water here. And let's do this guy over here. If it's not quite moving like you want it to, you can just use a little bit more water. Let's go this way. I need more paint. Okay. It's okay if you don't hit every single area. Uh-oh, I splattered. Oh no, more texture. Yeah, I think that'll be that. And then let's put some dark in here. This brush feels a little extra stiff. I need some water. Why I put them on opposite sides of each other, I don't know. You're definitely wanting to make sure you're going with the grain of your wood. And you're blending all these colors together, right? That's the idea here of a wet blend, is that you want the colors to be blending together, not just entirely candy stripes. More water, more paint. Sometimes your brush will pop on you. All right. So that's a wet blend. You've got a bunch of colors blending together. I'm going to add a little bit of brown into this guy, because why not? Yeah. That's the first step when actually getting your color going. What's next on my list here? So now I'm going to put this guy aside. And grab the one that's dry. This one is a little less contrasty than that one, I think. I think I just used a lot more red and brown on this one. So this is sort of like the undercolor. We've got, you know, the wood colors going on, but we don't have a ton of grain happening. There's a little bit. Some of the grain you may have saw on the one I just did, because of the water, will likely fade out a little bit. So you do need to go back into it some and add some more. I have two more colors specifically for that. One is a very purpley red. More of a just straight up reddish brown. So you can do grain in a number of different ways. So you can cut up an old brush and actually put in some marks in it that way. You can just use an older brush that's just really jaggedy, like some of the ones here that I have. Like, this brush has seen better days, as you can probably see. It's not perfect. It might work for that. But I like to use these in combination with other things. You can also use a graining tool. This is typically for more fine furniture, stuff that you're going to actually look really up close at. I wouldn't really use this on a floor because, I mean, in order to use it, you have to be basically down on your hands and knees. No fun. But for furniture and things, it works very nice. It's a really cool. So also big pieces of scenery, it works really well. The beams that we created for hay fever had a really fun combo of things. And I think I'm going to show you, I want to show you how it works, even though I'm not going to show you on the actual project. So I'm going to move over to this dude. Might need to, that's okay, it'll be right. So in this case, you're using more, it's more of a subtraction and not an addition, right? So you're painting a surface, and this surface is not the best, and then you're running this tool through it to leave like a wood grain-like texture. And it looks pretty cool. Students are always way into it. It also has like these comb bits on this side, and then on the back side, you can swap this head around too. Oh, let me get that in frame. And you can drag that. Well, let me do a little bit more. You can drag that through to get lines as well. Pretty cool, but they're small. They do make larger ones, but they're a little impractical. Another way to do this that I like to do is you can use dark color as an example. You can combine them, right? So I use a graining tool, and maybe I get too heavy in it there. So let's say I grained this with this graining brush. I can go ahead in here where it's starting to bleed out, and I can use this to sort of add a little bit of grain to it. And so you just do that in a couple of places here and there, and that will give you the appearance of it and tell your audience a little bit more about what the grain is like. So this paint is kind of thin, so it's bleeding out and not holding it straight. But they're handy tools. I like to use the combo method quite a bit for larger scenery that I have to paint by hand and not on the floor. So if it's up on a sawhorses, I'll consider using the graining tool. Gotta protect your back, painters. So I will use it occasionally, but I don't typically use it as doing all of my grading. So, yeah, so doing combing works well. You can, so I'm just going to give this a whirl. Do I have more brushes? I do. Rinse one real quick. And use this clean one. Oh, and I can, you can also, you can also paint grain by hand individually, which is a lot more work, but it's possible. I'll demonstrate it real quick just so you can see. But in this case, I'm just going to use some of this liner color. But you can, you know, do each dang grain. It's kind of crazy. But you can do fun things like adding in knots and stuff like that. This works well when you're doing drops, for instance. You have a little bit more control over the paint, but maybe there's another knot right here, right? But that's tedious. You can't do it all day long to do a whole floor. So I tend not to do that too much. And if you're not careful, it can also look kind of cartoony. So I typically stick with a graining brush or just a plain beat-up brush. What are you on time? You seem okay. So this first dude is a graining brush. It's going to do straight up lines. And I'm putting very little pressure on this. Like if you put a lot of pressure, it's just gonna turn out solid, which is bad. So I'm not gonna do all of them this way, and I'm gonna kind of fade them out. You can also just like do parts of it. Right, so you're just giving it a little bit of line. And then you can also use, let's use this plum color. And you want this to be a little bit rough. Oh, color. So part of the reason you're doing this also is now you're wanting to really individualize the boards. So you want to add like some different colors to different boards so that they read as separate. Because as you know, I'm sure have noticed maybe. Oh, did I just dip that in the wrong color? I did. Shame. All right. So, yeah, you really want to like make your boards individual and special snowflakes, right? Like each one wants to be its own unique thing. This guy got kind of messed up, but I'm going to add a little bit of color in here. So, that's the graining. Yeah. So technically that's called glazing as well. Like when you're trying to individualize different areas where you're not, there's a difference between glazing and washes. Glazing is doing like individual areas. Washes are where you do the entire thing. So that is not what we're doing here. So let's move on to our next step. Here's one all ready to go. So you can see on this one, I feel like I did a better job with the grain. I wasn't talking, so I think it turned out much better. You can kind of see the variety that I'm trying to get in there of the different kinds. So this next step is what I call marrying, which is bringing everything back together again. And to do that, I'm using a wash. This is a definite wash. It's a thin paint of a solid color over the whole thing. You could theoretically use two different colors of this to wet blend it as well. I had that color already anyway. Let me do this. Okay. This is my favorite painting stick, so I have favorites. You end up with favorites, it's true. This is not my favorite brush for this, though. I know it's stupid, but much rather use that one or the one. So the reason I'm choosing this brush over that one is because it's got a little bit longer bristles. It's in a little bit better shape right now. And it doesn't matter. Like I'm using a lot of beat up brushes for this because those beat up brushes help give us all that grain. And so this one I want a little bit nicer because it's going to be going over the whole thing. And it's pretty simple. It's just all of it. You can also not, like you can leave little areas that did not get it. If it's making an area too dark or you're wanting a little bit more variety, you could leave areas with a little bit less or more, and it'll add a little bit more variety. Like that hot spot right there. No matter what I do, it's probably going to stay a hot spot, which is great. I think that's a good variety, happy accident kind of thing that will look good on stage. So this floor, that sample that I'm doing here is for mostly a nicer interior kind of wood. Obviously, color choice is going to be a big part of what's going to make it something look finer or not fine. I'll talk a little bit more about distressing at the end. So yeah, that's that. That helps with that. So as you can see, it's what really makes these guys sing in the end is the lining coming back. And it's hard to see the lines right now because they've been redone. So that's why when I started, I said, you know, we'll have to do that again. But it really makes it pop. All right. Let's look. I don't know where to put them. I'm running out of room, y'all. So here's one that I have relined. As you can see, it pops out much nicer. That helps a lot. Also in this one, as a demonstration for what you can do for less nice wood, or wood that needs to look a little more rough, is you can redo the lining, but you can break up the lines so they're not so nice and neat. So that's a way to be like, this is rough, this is not as nice and neat. And to do that, you just, when you're lining, you hop your brush a little bit as you go, which again takes a little bit of practice so you don't get these giant teardrop shapes. But you can go slow as you go. Uh-oh, we're getting sunlight on us. Sunlight in the frame. Let's pull that back a touch. So, some of the last steps I would do here is I would seal it with something. So, Scenic Paint, like I said, has less binder in it, right, at the beginning. That means that if this were to get wet again, paint would come off. So, for instance, if you're mopping before the show, that would be bad. So we have to seal it in some way. I have a number of sealers that I like. This is my favorite. It's gotten more expensive though, polyacrylic. So it's like a urethane, but it's water-based, so it's amazing. I particularly like satin, I think. So here's the thing about finish. Depending on your surface, like how many pieces of sheet goods you're using, or what the surface of your paint is, you may not want it to be too glossy. For instance, if it's like ours, it's a floor that you just paint over and over and over again all the time. That surface is pretty beat up. And if you make it shiny, it's going to make every imperfection show up in the stage light, and it'll lose your illusion. And you'll see all of the sheet good lines, right? The sheet good seams. So satin seems to me has been a very nice happy medium. It's got a little bit of shine. It makes everything glow. It makes your colors look richer once it's sealed. Right now it feels a little chalky to me. So, and I don't use this straight out of the can. I mix it 50-50 with water. It does not need to be straight out. So even then, that cuts some of the shine on as well. You can do gloss, but just be aware that it's going to it's going to show off stuff you may or may not want shown off. So that's part of it. They make a flat as well. No, they don't. I don't know if they make this in flat, but they do this in gloss. Roscoe also makes a clear finish. Premier Clear, this one happens to be gloss. They make a flat. I think they make a semi or satin. But the stuff tends to be pretty expensive too, so I don't use this as much. And in the past, it's been finicky. I've had this cloud on me before, mostly with flat. Flat is notoriously bad about clouding, which would be bad. You paint your whole floor or your whole surface, then you paint it with flat, and then it looks kind of milky white, and that's sad. This is me apparently not endorsing flat from Roscoe. I think that's gotten better over the years. Often what will do that is if you roller sealer onto a surface, the roller, all that, it just traps all these little bubbles of air into it, and that's what clouds. So you definitely want to be brushing on these sealers. And the polyacrylic, you can brush that on. I mean, the brush is going to give you nice with the grain action anyway. Sometimes I just don't have time for that, and 50/50 polyacrylic will go into a sprayer really nicely, and I'll spray the sealer on. If I have my druthers, though, for wood floor or wood surface, I will brush it on. Sometimes it takes a long time, but it looks better. So you can also, I mean, also the floor wax works really well. I would do a coat of something else first before using like future floor wax. The other challenge with future floor wax is that it makes it a little more difficult to paint over it again. So if you're planning to reuse it, this is not called future anymore. Gosh, I can't get it out of my head. For decades, this kind of floor wax was made by Future Wax. It has been bought by Pledge and is now Pledge Revive It, which will never trip off my tongue the way Future Wax does. So I just call it Future Wax. But it's great stuff, super glossy, self-leveling, which is nice. Like, so it will look really, you won't get brush strokes or anything out of this. I've literally applied this with mops, and it looks fantastic because it self-levels. And it's great stuff, super glossy, and it looks beautiful. But if you want to paint over it again, you have to like go over that surface with a mop and some like ammonia and water or something that's slightly acidic-y to like cut the gloss so that it will accept paint again, which is, you know, just an extra step, but something to keep in mind. Let's see. So now, what if you don't want your floor to be perfect and beautiful, or whatever your surface is? You want it to be more distressed like that other wood. For that, I like to do what's called a spatter and drag. Yeah, my favorite brush apparently is what is required. And then this big old guy. Oh, I don't need that. But this one. Okay, let's move some things out of the way. So for this, so Scenic Paint has a tendency to settle to the bottom when it's mixed with water. So you do have to stir it. This color, some colors are worse than others, and it really just depends on what color you're using, because it's whatever the pigment is made out of. So I'm going to get some color. I'm going to use a start color. I'm going to hand spatter it. And the hand spatter, I'm just smacking, not the brush or the bristles. I'm smacking this piece here with my hand to get. And you want to keep it fairly perpendicular to the surface. If you're like this, you're going to shoot spatter that way. So you want to keep it this way so it comes down. And I'm going to lightly spatter this whole surface. I'm going to do it pretty heavy because I want it to look pretty beat up. So Now what you do is once you have this, can you zoom in on that dude? The sunlight is getting in our way again. Yeah, there you go. So once it's on there, you got to do this fairly quickly while it's still wet. You just take a very dry brush. This does not want to be wet because that'll remove the paint. And you just take this dry brush and you drag it through the surface. And it makes, well, it looks sort of like worn or eaten wood. How it sort of chips away over time, you know. We do this on a lot of our woods. It adds a little age, which is really nice. And it turns out so great. So you could do this. This is in a dark color. You could do this in a light color. If you're doing a lighter color wood or something that is like a grayer wood, like for instance, if we're talking about distressing or kinds of wood, like exterior woods that are outside in the straight sunlight all the time tend to be very bleached out and not this saturate, right? So the color choices you're going to use there would be more like in keeping with this example here, right? It's very gray. There's a lot of gray in exterior wood, especially if it's just unpainted raw wood, right? Sometimes they'll, like teak will turn a little bit of a more yellowish color, but having like image samples to be painting from is super, super helpful. So in this case, you might want to use like, you can kind of see almost on that smaller sample there, you can kind of see what I'm talking about with that distress in there. That you could also do a spatter with a light color and then spray over it very lightly with a fine watery mist. And it'll get it to bleed out kind of like that. And it'll look sort of like lichen, which was what was that other example I showed at the very beginning kind of looked like. Right? So this, which is upside down. So that has exactly that done. It is a white that's been spattered over it with, and I think instead of adding water after the fact, I believe the surface was damp before spraying it with the white, and it gave it that sort of lichen-y texture. And you can see this is really gray, but it's very, very blue and gray and green. So a lot of grays will have a blue-green tint to them. That one I showed you in the camera a minute ago had a lot of sort of mint green in it. It may not have shown up real well on the camera, but it did. So distressed wood looks like that. Some of your graining might be more pronounced in a distressed wood. Like the wood here is much, much softer, and the grain is a little less pronounced. Man, that sunlight's killing us. See if we can tilt that up. Yeah. Granted, we just distressed it, but it's a lot softer color. In a rougher wood, your grain might be more pronounced. Like for instance, in this sample here again, I'll show it again. You can kind of see the grain is wider because it started to deteriorate, right? So that's kind of what happens sometimes. Yeah, let's see. What else did I have here to cover? Yeah, sunlight will age and lighten wood, so it tends to be lighter. If it's really like mossy and gross wood, like that'll tend to be much darker. And you can do like what I was showing you there earlier with the lichen color. You could use a white. You could also use some greens in there as spattered and bled out to give you that lichen or mold texture as well. Other things you might do to wood after the fact would be like maybe you want you know, your paint looks like it's a little chipped. It has paint on top of it that it's worn away. You can use blocking for that. Now this isn't a wood underneath here, but this is a sample of blocking. So this is just a small chunk of wood like this, stuck like like you would a sponge. If you're sponge painting, you have sort of a palette, right, of paint. You dip that in there and then you rub it over the surface and it'll give you that chippiness. So you could do that over some wood of various colors. I do this a lot if there's like, for instance, the Kit Kat Club on the cabaret floor was done like this with the letters so that it looked like it was partially worn away from all the dancing, right? So, and there was some other color not in that rendering that ended up being painted around the border of that stage too, and we also did this technique to that. In this case, I don't know if it reads very well on camera, but we could switch it over here. Maybe it'll show up. You can see there's a little bit of a grain to it. I wanted this to look like it was painted wood, like it was painted on top of wood. So I added a little bit of grain to it so that it would look like it had a little bit of a rhyme or reason to it. So it just didn't look like flat painted surface with blocking on it. Generally speaking, you can create wood out of a lot of different colors. It's all about the coloring choices, right? And how you apply it is pretty typically the same. As scenic artists, what you have to do is look at that sample that you're given and be able to like pick out like what are the layers that are happening there. What's the lightest possible color to maybe be your base color? What is the darkest final wash over the whole thing going to be? And you just sort of start thinking that way a lot. You do a lot. When I was painting full time, I mean, I would look at all kinds of things and be like, oh, I paint that. How do I paint that? It just sort of happens. But those layers start to speak to you and pop out. So woods can look like anything. I have a bunch of examples. This is a different wood floor from Bright Star. The intent of this was to have it look like it was painted. Oops, that's not the sample I was after. I wanted it to look like colorful stained wood, which is tricky to do. Like this is one of my inspiration images. This is all stained wood. So we had all these different colors of wood that was happening in one wood floor, and the layout was quite crazy and intense, but it looked really good. You could also, this is a really dark, this is a grayish, this might have a lot of reflection in it. Sort of a gray, purple gray, brown gray wood from another show. So this has plastic covering it because I didn't want to get paint on it. So if the designer gives you a beautiful rendering like this, you want to make sure to protect it. You don't get any paint on it. So thank you all for coming. And I think we're going to wrap it up there, baby.